Hello, I'm Richard Dolan, and welcome to the latest installment of UFOs, the Big Picture. I'd like quickly to mention that I now have a weekly newsletter. So if you want to keep track of what I'm up to, it's an easy way to get free weekly updates. I'd certainly recommend you give it a try. Now, I've talked recently about UFO crash retrievals on this live stream, but I think it's a good idea to revisit and deepen some of the things I've discussed before. And that's because there's a truly impressive amount of information and testimony out there. This time, I want to provide testimony via sources that have very high social standing in our society. Some of the people are former senators. Some were leading top generals. Others were famous astronauts. Others were prominent defense executives. All of them provided very interesting information about the existence of crashed UFOs and of programs designed to study the technology and alien bodies associated with them. Keep in mind, these stories, maybe we can call them quiet leaks, have been coming out for over 50 years. Now, even though they go back to the 1950s and 60s, it wasn't until the late 1970s that a large number of them began to appear in public. The researcher Leonard Stringfield published a book back in 1977 called Situation Red, the UFO Siege. It was the first serious book on UFOs that discussed crash retrievals in a serious way. Stringfield's mentioning of such stories was brief, but it was enough to get the attention of quite a few people who had stories of their own. And after that book came out, many of them flocked to him quietly to give him their own account. These included stories not only of UFO crash retrievals, but sometimes of people who had seen dead alien bodies and things like that. The stories that Stringfield collected were, nothing short of astonishing, in my opinion. He was able to investigate a lot of them. He was unable to investigate some of them, but he always used his best judgment and common sense to evaluate them. And overall, I think they tell a very consistent story. One interesting story came to him through a fellow researcher named Charles Wilhelm. As an adolescent or teenager in 1959, Wilhelm listened to a deathbed confession from a neighbor whose lawn he used to cut. This woman was dying of cancer, and she told him that she had once held a top security clearance at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and that she had seen two saucer-shaped craft in a secret hangar. One craft was intact, the other was damaged. She also knew of two small creatures, she said, preserved inside another secret building, and had personally handled the paperwork on their autopsy report. And what she said to this young teenage neighbor of hers was, "Uncle Sam can't do anything to me after I'm in the grave." Charles Wilhelm related actually another story to Stringfield, somewhat of a similar story, a little bit less detail. It was something that he had been told in 1966 by a friend whose father had worked with Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and it was nearly identical to what his dying neighbor had told him. On the father's deathbed, he had told his son that he had seen two disc-shaped craft, one intact, one damaged, along with four preserved small alien bodies packed in chemicals, he said. Now, there are a few of these stories that Stringfield had collected back in the 60s, but this was just a tiny tip of the iceberg compared with what he collected after he published Situation Red. They came in dozens and then scores of them at a time. One source of Stringfield said that the US military was designing a radar system to detect UFOs, and that Navy nuclear submarines were equipped with instruments to detect submerged UFOs. Another related retrieval of a crash UFO somewhere in the American Southwest in 1957, in which four humanoid bodies were recovered with great difficulty. In another case that came to Stringfield, a witness claimed to have seen 9 alien bodies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1966. They were 4 feet tall. He added that the craft was also at the base, And at certain military bases, there were mobile units ready at all times to recover downed UFOs. Yet another of Stringfield's witnesses, this was a doctor. He interviewed this man many times, and I'm quite sure I've mentioned this doctor here on this program once or twice before. Nevertheless, he's an interesting and an important person. He told Stringfield that he had autopsied an alien body himself and gave Stringfield a great deal of information while they were in communication. Then that doctor just seemed to shut down and disappear. Very interesting. There were more witnesses. One was a contractor at Wright Pat during the 60s, claimed to have seen 7 alien bodies under conditions of extreme security. Yet another, a former Air Force intelligence officer, said that back in 1948, he had seen a top secret manuscript about a UFO crash in New Mexico, in which craft and bodies were recovered. Yet another witness, a radar specialist at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, told Stringfield that back in 1953, he had been shown a film of a crashed UFO in the desert, which included the interior of the craft and dead alien beings inside a tent. This individual had not been given any explanation or debriefing regarding what he had been shown. I think it's very interesting that we've got this pattern in many cases of witnesses coming and stating dead bodies and craft at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which of course is the headquarters of the United States Air Force. In any case, Stringfield held on to these stories fairly quietly for a while, but eventually did publish them for the UFO research community, where they were debated pro and con for a while, and now, well, they seem to have been forgotten, unfortunately. Now, another connection to UFOs and alien bodies at Wright-Patterson was the Senator Barry Goldwater, who not only was a general in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, but ran for president on the Republican Party ticket in 1964. Goldwater was as military-friendly a politician as you could find in Washington, and that's no small matter. He was even one of the first civilians to take a ride in the legendary aircraft, the SR-71 Blackbird. One of Goldwater's closest friends was General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. Several times, Goldwater discussed how LeMay had rebuffed and denied his attempts to gain access to the area in Wright-Patterson where alien bodies and technology were believed to be held, sometimes called the Blue Room. So I think it's interesting here to state that these leaks, which were coming quietly to people like Stringfield and others, were also circulating in very rarefied circles, including a leading senator of the United States of America. In any case, Goldwater, wanting to get access to this, well, he said this was not a success at all. He said this was the only time in their friendship that LeMay had gotten angry with him. LeMay told the senator, never mention this topic again. In one letter to a constituent, Goldwater wrote, this thing has gotten so highly classified, it's just impossible to get anything on it. Now, Curtis LeMay may have gotten a little testy with his friend Barry Goldwater, but he actually did, as far as I can tell, let his guard down at least one time. I met a gentleman who told me of his encounter in 1987 with the retired Air Force legend. After meeting with this witness and learning about his key personal details, I'll only add that there's no doubt in my mind that his account is truthful. So the witness, who we'll just call Jim, was an active ham radio operator. He was living in Orange County, California. During October 1987, he struck up a very engaging radio conversation with an elderly gentleman about various aircraft, when he overheard the operator refer to his companion as General. Now, Jim didn't know the identity of his new friend until he called the FCC office in Long Beach to look up the address of W6EZV. That was the name of the person he was talking with. And the result of that was Curtis E. LeMay, who was living in Newport Beach, California. So a week later, Jim found LeMay on the air, talking with another person by the handle K0DWC. That turned out to be a three-star general named Francis Butch Griswold. More on him in a moment. After that conversation ended, Jim contacted LeMay again for another pleasant conversation about aircraft and someone else whose interests they shared, a jazz band leader named Tex Beneke, whom Jim had previously encountered on the ham airwaves, and someone that Curtis LeMay was a big fan of. So Jim decided to try meeting with LeMay. He drove to Newport Beach and found his home. About 11 o'clock in the morning, he rang the security door button as a camera swiveled to face him. Helen LeMay, wife of the general, answered. When she learned that this was Kurt's friend, her voice brightened and she let him through. Inside the LeMay house was a 4-foot-high bust of the general, and then Jim saw the man himself, General Curtis LeMay. For a short while, the two talked in a friendly manner about aircraft and then about Tex Beneke. And then Jim asked a different sort of question. General, he said, was the 1947 crash at Roswell related to an alien craft? Well, I'm sure you could just have felt the air getting thicker at that moment. LeMay just looked at him silently. Without saying a word, he nodded his head up and down, just like this, Jim told me. He was obviously saying yes, and just as obviously did not want to say it out loud. Jim wondered maybe he was being monitored. Meanwhile, in the next room, Helen had answered the telephone, and Jim heard her speaking with someone and then saying, Butch, you wouldn't believe what Kurt is talking about right now. A moment later, she entered the room. Butch Griswold is on the phone, she said to her husband, and he wants to talk to you. Jim took the chance to say goodbye to the 4-star general, and he drove home. His head was swimming. Later that afternoon, while he was on his ham radio, he saw the address, K0DWC, that was Griswold, and that person made a statement, quote, well, we figured out who the mystery guest was. It seemed pretty clear that General Butch Griswold was not too pleased about Curtis LeMay's indiscretion. That was the end of Jim's communication with Curtis LeMay. The general died 3 years later. Perhaps some people might not believe that Jim's encounter with Curtis LeMay really happened. To those people, I will only say that having met with Jim and reviewed his ham radio information, including Curtis LeMay's ham radio information, which was legally available, and going over the encounter repeatedly in detail, that I am entirely convinced this event took place just as he told me. LeMay, nearing the end of his life, for reasons we will never know, decided to make an important admission to a new acquaintance. Hey, stranger things have happened. Now, I understand how skeptics might say, great story, totally unconfirmed. Well, confirmation is important. But what do you do when, decade after decade, leaks from prominent sources saying the same thing keep coming out? What do you make of the statements given by Ben Rich, for instance, man who for many years headed Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division? Ben Rich has been called the father of stealth, having overseen the development of the stealth fighter, the 117A Nighthawk. Before Ben Rich died in January 1995, he made several startlingly open statements about the reality of UFOs and extraterrestrials. Now, one was in a 1986 letter to a friend and colleague, John Andrews, one of Lockheed's great engineers. Andrews had written to Rich, stating his own belief in lots of UFOs, both man-made, which he called Category A, and extraterrestrial, which he called Category B. Andrews, in a letter that's freely available in the public domain, asked Ben Rich if Ben Rich's own belief covered extraterrestrial as well as man-made UFOs. And Ben Rich's reply was very succinct, if a tad enigmatic. Yes, Ben Rich wrote back to Andrews. He said, I'm a believer in both categories. I feel everything is possible. He went on and wrote, many of our man-made UFOs are unfunded opportunities. And there he underlined the U, the F, and the O of that phrase. Now, I would say it's important to recognize that Ben Rich's stated belief that extraterrestrials were here on Earth. I mean, that's one thing that he just put right out there. Now, true, he stated this as a belief rather than knowledge to Andrews. But you got to remember, Ben Rich was the CEO of a large organization. People like that are not prone to making blatant statements about anything, and certainly not something as sensitive as UFOs. Ben Rich was in an excellent position to form his opinion. During the course of his career, he had access to people of the highest intellectual caliber who, in turn, were exposed to some of the most sensitive secrets of the nation. I mean, my goodness, he himself was one such person, having managed the stealth fighter program. Ben Rich was in as good a position as anyone to have genuine information on the matter of UFOs. The most provocative part of his reply to Andrews was his remark about unfunded opportunities. And I've often wondered, what might that mean? There might seem to be two possibilities in my view. One is that the program to build UFOs was so secret, so black, that funding would be so deeply hidden as to be non-existent, uh, as it were. Hence, the project would be unfunded, so to speak. The other possibility, one which I lean toward, is that man-made UFOs were derived from the active study of extraterrestrial UFOs, presumably in the form of crash retrievals or other freebies, hence unfunded. Benrich had more than this to say on the matter of UFOs. On March 23rd, 1993, he spoke at the UCLA School of Engineering, presenting a generally standard history of skunkworks. Then at the end of his presentation, he provided a remarkable statement: "We now have the technology to take ET home." Now, it turns out this was actually a tagline that Ben Rich had used for many of his lectures over the years, and seems to have been a little more coy and humorous than provocative in intent. Since 1983, in various lectures, he had referred to Skunkworks getting a contract to take ET home, obviously a reference to Steven Spielberg's movie ET the Extraterrestrial, came out in 1983. Even so, the statement startled a few people in attendance in this 1993 lecture. And after most of the attendees filed out, a few stayed behind, hoping, I would assume, that Ben Rich would clarify or expand or spill the beans on whatever it was he meant. Two of these people were Jan Harzan, who at the time was a senior executive with IBM. He's now the director of the Mutual UFO Network, international director. And the other was Tom Keller, an aerospace engineer who worked as a computer systems analyst for NASA's JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab. In any case, according to both of them, Ben Rich was surrounded by a small group of people and made a few other statements, such as, "We now know how to travel to the stars." Another, "There is an error in the equations and we have figured it out and now know how to travel to the stars, and it won't take a lifetime to do it." Also, he said it is time to end all the secrecy on this, as it no longer poses a national security threat, and make the technology available for use in the private sector. And finally, Harzan said in a statement that he considered to be very, very close, a close paraphrase. Ben Rich said, "There are many in the intelligence community who would like to see this stay in the black and not see the light of day." Now, Ben Rich didn't explicitly state that ET was living among us. And he didn't even state explicitly that UFOs were real. On the other hand, he did make a very clear statement that the technology within the classified world was well beyond anything imaginable in the public realm. Now, James Goodall, an aviation journalist, knew Ben Rich very well and also had something to add about Ben Rich. Goodall spoke to Rich about 10 days before he died, which would have been shortly after or around Christmas of 1994. And according to Goodall, he just said about 10 days before he died that he was speaking to Ben Rich on the telephone. And he said, and Ben Rich said, "Jim, we have things out in the desert that are 50 years beyond what you can comprehend." They have about 4,500 people at the Lockheed Skunk Works. What have they been doing for the last 18 or 20 years? They're building something. Those are almost the last words Ben Rich ever spoke. One more high profile individual ought to be mentioned in this context. And that's the late former Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon. And as such, Mitchell had access to elite figures throughout the U.S. national security structure. Certainly, he was in a very good position to know matters of importance relating to space and national security. So I would say it's very significant that for many years, several times, Dr. Mitchell spoke publicly about the reality of a deeply secret program to study extraterrestrial technology and bodies. In private, well, I had several private conversations with Edgar Mitchell, and he added to me that he had learned most of this information from two very elite connections, he said to me, who told him about the existence of this program, and that they did so at great risk personally, professionally, and to their families. That was his exact statement to me, that the people who came to him to talk about these programs did so at great risk personally, professionally, and to their families. Now, that's very interesting to me. And of course, the response from our so-called establishment media has been to ignore or even belittle such statements as that. Look, UFO crash retrievals are a subject that has quietly, and I would say sometimes not so quietly, percolated within the UFO community for many, many years. Sometimes talk about it has seeped into the general public, but whenever it has, it's usually been in a very simplistic and I would even say cartoonish fashion. The reality is much more complex. What we know is that there have been quite a few reasonably well investigated cases and quite a few statements from people of great accomplishment whose words deserve our attention. Something important has been going on for a long time. Exotic and highly advanced technology have been acquired in secrecy. Bodies, dead and perhaps live, have been recovered. An entire infrastructure has developed around the program to study and presumably replicate as much of it as possible. I'm Richard Dolan, and I want to thank you for watching. If you like what you see here, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on notifications so you never miss a new video. And if you want to keep track of what I'm doing, please subscribe to my free newsletter. It comes out every week, and a link is available below this video. Thank you again for your attendance and for your support with all that I do. Very much appreciated. And thanks for coming to see UFOs, the big picture.